to reconvene for our wrap-up session of BridgeWork to send money, prayers, and people, the evolving exchange between belief and action in global humanitarian work. And I think today's conversation has clearly been a beginning. It has, for me, raised many questions. But the three that come to mind are three that I had the honor to hear Rabbi Dennis Sasso talk about when I was in Indianapolis earlier this week. Rabbi Sasso was at Beth El Zedek Synagogue in Indianapolis. If you ever have a chance to hear him, he is just one of the most thoughtful religious speakers and thinkers that I've ever met. But he was talking about Genesis and how it starts with an affirmation and then gives us three questions. The affirmation is that we are made in God's image. And I heard that throughout the conversation today, that is the starting affirmation across religious traditions, that we human beings are made in God's image, and that's the beginning point. Then the first question is the question that God asks Adam, and he says, "Where are you? Where are you? Where are we located? You know, what is our globe, our neighborhood, our community, our jurisdiction of accountability and responsibility? Where are you?" The second question is God's to Cain. Where is your brother? Where is your brother? And that question I think we've heard asked and answered in all sorts of ways today. Who is our neighbor? Who is our brother? And the third is Cain to God. Am I my brother's keeper? Now, it sounds a little like a rhetorical question, right? What? Am I my brother's keeper? But I think what's been so enlivening today is how seriously our presenters have taken that question and asked, what does it mean to keep one another? Rabbi Sasso also reminds us that in Judaism, creation is understood as incomplete. We are made in God's image so that we can continue to complete the work of God's creation. And so the answers to that question are never finished. And I think that I will leave it there for my comments and now ask Professor Allison Schnable to offer any thoughts of hers.
Well, I have very little to say at this point. It's really gilding the lily after all the great things we've heard. So I enjoyed hearing, especially from all the practitioners and the undergraduates giving their talks. So something about Miranda's talk really, really stuck out for me. Because in some ways, what your talk was, it's about what happens when you realize that your faith can be used for evil. I can tell how much that hit you. That's really what this is about. So how do we make sense of that? And I thought, for me, as someone who's interested in development, there's another angle on this. If you talk to the DRC, people in the DRC back in the 80s, DRC, that's the abbreviation of the Dutch Reformed Church, if you would have asked them probably in the 70s and 80s about their support for apartheid, they would probably say, we are the locals here. You can't understand. Everything we've talked about today has been about local knowledge, right? Or at least that's something I've talked about. The DRC would have said, we're the ones with the local knowledge. So who are you to presume to tell us what the right interpretation of faith is here? So here's a place where local knowledge really went awry. Maybe they talked about it being necessary and there being some suffering and harm as a result of the policies of apartheid. Maybe if there had been the real relationships between the members of that church or that denomination and the people who were affected by the apartheid policies, maybe they couldn't have felt the way they did. So maybe that true idea of accompaniment, of having meaningful relationships between people. So the idea of relationship has been a theme here, and I think the idea of relationship is one that's big among Christians in general, especially among Protestant Christians. Where that meaningful principle can go wrong is if you go from the idea that relationships matter and problems can be solved within the context of relationships to believing that ultimately all problems are personal and can be solved through personal intervention or can be solved in a dyadic way. We've heard from some very wise people today that sometimes two people sitting down together can't just solve a problem. Sometimes you've got to go to court. Sometimes you've got to fight. Sometimes you have to sue. There are also laws and big political decisions that affect all these principles and all these situations we're talking about today. The war that has brought all of these refugees out of Syria, that didn't happen because of a conflict between individuals. These are geopolitical issues, and these are decisions made by governments, including our government. The reason that these immigrants are in detention are because of laws our government makes, and lobbyists who give influence into how immigrants are detained and the conditions under which they are detained. So no one would ever say that we shouldn't have somebody sitting next to you in the jail. We need that, but we need something besides that as well. We can't just take simply a personal responsibility or a personal relationship set of solutions to all problems. So these are sort of the conflicts that have stuck with me today. This has been a very rich collection of individuals and ideas, and it's been a real pleasure to think through them with you.
Thank you. And again, I'm not sure there's also a lot more to add. The sort of constant thread I did hear through all the presentations was around relationship. And again, not just in a sense of one person making a difference in one person's life, but it's through these relationships that we deepen understanding, that we're inspired, that we find our courage, that we're transformed as much as the person who is perceived to be vulnerable or in need. And that often happens through simple transactions of telling stories and listening carefully to one another. And that those relationships are not, it's not solely about just so I go away feeling good, or that the person, even that I visited, is feeling like they have a friend and they're not alone. But that then I'm called to do something about that and with that experience, to take that on board and feel compelled to tell that story, to tell you the story about Nebi, who I met in Atlanta, to hope that and call you to be as angry as I am about systems that are broken and harm and hurt people, and to invite you to be part of change, a wider social change for laws and practices and communities that are more just. The only thing I wanted to mention that we didn't talk about much, that I find an interesting set of questions, is the first part of the title of this, which is Send Money. And it's about the money. And it's about the money that's provided globally in aid. It's about the money that flows to partner organizations. It's about the expectation that certain programs and service are not part of the public good to the point that it should be funded by our tax dollars, but rather it should be funded privately through charitable giving. When and why will we hold, when will we hold our own government accountable to say, actually these things are important for a wider public good, and it should be the way our tax dollars are invested, and to explore and ask questions about how really, it was touched on in small ways, but how money in partnerships and relationships with grassroots international NGOs, money will always change the relationship. It will always change the relationship. And that, and it is reality. And rarely does it change the relationship for good, but it adds a more complicated dimension to the relationship. So my reflection.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for organizing this. I really appreciate it. So proud of all my students. and all the students I haven't had. It's hard to be the third one down the line when it's so much wisdom has been dispensed. I guess one of the things that came to mind was, what is the connection between some of the comments this morning and what we were looking at this afternoon? And there seems to be somewhat of a disconnect. And I don't think it was intentional at all. But essentially today, this morning, we were talking about how do we take our sort of efforts, our money, our influence, our NGOs, and make a difference elsewhere, be it Asia, Africa, or Latin America. This afternoon, much of it was, well, what happens when those who are political prisoners or victims of circumstances beyond their control come here? What do we do with refugees? What do we do with asylum seekers? And I was sitting at the very back and I was going, okay, what's the connection? What's the connection? What's the connection? And I think there is a connection, and I think it's connection fruitful of more inquiry as we push forward, and as you students sort of think in terms of your careers and what you sort of want to engage your minds on. And that is, I think, oftentimes, and this maybe connects with the whole issue of money, oftentimes we think of money as sort of one way, from the white population here in the United States to agencies, NGOs elsewhere. But I think Yanan was pointing to another direction. Certainly, Allison talked about it this morning when she was talking about remittances. And that is, we have a whole lot of people now, oftentimes immigrants, who have been given green cards and so forth, who are now situated here in the United States, who, when you start really talking to them about their identity and their notion of nationalism, it's not national, it's very transnational. And their greatest desire would be to someday move back to Syria, move back to Eritrea, move back to wherever it is, Rwanda, for example, and make a difference and transform the politics there. And many of them are sort of forming communities. I think Caleb probably could tell us a lot about the Somali community, the Eritrean community, the Oromo community in Minneapolis. And what are they sort of doing? They're sort of creating alternate civil societies that are not necessarily rested in the nation, but are civil societies abroad, are political parties, are various ways of bringing back remittances and development to their own. And I think there would be a very, very fruitful sort of path of inquiry to maybe try to bridge these two. What are we as basically a Western population doing, but what are also our sisters and brothers who are now situated in our nation doing also for their own their own relatives or their own sort of ethnic group wherever it is. And where does that line come, sort of cross? How can we sort of cross-fertilize our thoughts, our understandings of development of appropriate and sustainable methods of transferring money for the benefit of all others? So I think this is a method sort of, or an area of inquiry that I would like to see many of you start considering as you push on towards your senior seminar. Thank you.
And Chuck, I would just say that it was intentional to suggest that global humanitarian work happens locally.
Yep.
In how whether we are from this country originally or have come here more recently, that is global humanitarian work, and that to segment these things out doesn't really make sense, but to see it as related and to see the money as also related. Are there any final thoughts or questions, observations from the group that you want to offer? Yeah, Andrew.
Well, I'd just like to say the Institute as a whole has been working on topic and the papers and putting everything together through, since about October, I think. And it's just been lovely to see today, to see everything, all of our collective work come to fruition. And I hope that you all had an amazing time and that we all learned something today.
Thank you. And again, thank you for all that work that went on between October and now, and for bringing this idea to us. I think that this BridgeWork conference and then the journal in which we will be able to publish the paper from Dr. Schnable as well as the student papers is an idea that you brought to us and will continue on. So we were already at lunch today talking about what theme or topic in faith and civic engagement we'd like to pick up next year. Like I said, the work of creation is never done. I know you all have creative work to go forth and do yet today, so I think at this point, I'm just going to say thank you to all of you, to the presenters, the moderators, the researchers. Thank you in absentia to Peter and Bonnie Raquette, two alums and key donors whose generosity towards the Institute has made this possible. Thanks to the Office of Campus Ministries and the Center for Church Relations for helping bring Linda Hartke here for this wonderful 3-day visit. Thanks to Chuck Schaefer and also Professor Amy Atchison for being conversation partners all the way along. And thanks to the snow for making this like a snow globe experience. And thank you all for coming. Be well. Travel home safely.